At the dawn of the 20th century, the world still looked eastward with ambition. To many in the West, Asia was not a partner to respect, but a prize to claim. From India to Indochina, European flags fluttered where once proud kingdoms had stood. Even China, the great Middle Kingdom, found itself carved and divided by foreign hands. But far across the sea, on the mist-covered islands of Japan, a different story was unfolding. Barely 40 years had passed since the Meiji Restoration, yet the transformation was almost unbelievable. Steam trains thundered across lands that once knew only samurai and rice fields. Telegraph wires sang with messages that could cross the nation in a heartbeat. In barracks and shipyards, soldiers and sailors trained with Western precision, modern, disciplined, and determined. To the outside world, Japan still seemed small, a curious newcomer in the global order, standing at the edge of a continent dominated by giants. But inside Japan, a fierce spark had ignited, a belief that the nation's destiny would no longer be written by others. And soon, this rising power would challenge one of the greatest empires on Earth. The question was not whether Japan was ready, but whether the world was ready for Japan. By the late 1800s, Russia was pushing ever eastward. Its Trans-Siberian Railway stretched across 8 time zones, a steel thread binding Europe to the Pacific. The Tsar's ministers dreamed of a warm water port, a gateway to Asia that would never freeze in winter. They found it at Port Arthur, on the southern tip of the Liaodong Peninsula, technically Chinese territory, but leased to Russia after the defeat of the Qing. For Japan, this was intolerable. After victory over China in 1895, Japan had expected recognition of its newfound strength. Instead, it was forced, by Russia, Germany, and France, to surrender its hard-won gains in Manchuria. The humiliation burned deep. Japan had built factories, schools, and fleets in imitation of the West, but the West still treated it as lesser. To restore pride and protect its future, Japan needed to prove that modernization was not imitation, it was transformation. Between Japan and Russia lay the peninsula of Korea. The dagger pointed at Japan's heart. If Russia controlled it, Japan would be vulnerable. If Japan secured it, the empire's defense and prosperity would be guaranteed. Throughout 1903, Tokyo sent proposal after proposal to St. Petersburg. Japan would recognize Russian influence in Manchuria if Russia respected Korea's independence. But the Tsar's ministers stalled, delayed, and condescended. To them, Japan was not an equal power, merely an ambitious newcomer. In secret, Japan's Prime Minister Katsura Taro and Foreign Minister Komura Jutaro concluded, "Negotiation is a dead end. Action must speak where words have failed." On the night of February 8, 1904, without a formal declaration of war, the Imperial Japanese Navy struck. In the cold waters off Port Arthur, Japanese torpedo boats slipped through darkness and fog. Their target, the pride of the Russian Pacific Fleet. At midnight, the sea exploded in fire. Russian battleships shuddered as torpedoes ripped through their hulls. When dawn came, black smoke curled over Port Arthur. 3 Russian ships were crippled, and Japan's fleet sailed away unharmed. The world gasped. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had attacked a European empire and won the opening round. For Japan, it was not just a military strike. It was a declaration that the age of Western monopoly on power was ending. After the surprise attack came a long and brutal siege. The Japanese army, led by General Nogi Marisuke, surrounded Port Arthur by land while Admiral Togo Hachiro maintained the blockade by sea. The Russians fought stubbornly, their fortress bristling with guns and concrete. For 11 months, artillery thundered across the hills of Manchuria. Tens of thousands of soldiers fell to bullets, disease, and starvation. In December 1904, Japanese troops captured the vital 203-meter hill, overlooking the harbor. From there, Japanese observers directed devastating fire onto the trapped Russian fleet below. By January 1905, Port Arthur surrendered. The cost was immense. over 60,000 Japanese dead or wounded, but the victory electrified the nation. Across Japan, newspapers hailed Nogi's stoic courage, and school children memorized the names of fallen heroes. The Meiji Emperor himself bowed in mourning, declaring that their sacrifice had proved Japan's modern spirit. While Port Arthur fell in the south, another colossal battle raged in the north. At Mukden, today's Shenyang, nearly 500,000 men clashed across the frozen plains of Manchuria. It was one of the largest land battles in human history. The Japanese, organized with precise logistics and discipline, advanced in coordinated wings. The Russians, stretched thin and poorly supplied, struggled to maintain their lines. For weeks, the two armies fought amid snowstorms and smoke, bayonet charges and machine gun fire. By early March 1905, Russian morale collapsed. The retreat turned to chaos. Broken regiments, abandoned guns, endless columns fleeing north. When the smoke cleared, the Russian army had lost over 90,000 men. The Japanese, exhausted but victorious, had captured Manchuria's capital. In Tokyo, people cheered, but the government knew the truth. Japan's resources were near exhaustion. Every bullet, every shell, had been produced at enormous cost. The nation was winning, but it could not fight forever. While the armies bled in Manchuria, Tsar Nicholas II sent reinforcements from the other side of the world. The Baltic Fleet, 8 months at sea, 18,000 miles of travel, steamed toward Japan, exhausted and ill-prepared. They had crossed half the globe to avenge Port Arthur. Waiting for them in the Tsushima Strait was Admiral Togo Heihachiro, commanding Japan's modern fleet. On May 27, 1905, the two forces sighted each other at dawn. Togo hoisted his battle signal. The fate of the empire rests on this battle. Let every man do his utmost. Then, with precision born of relentless training, the Japanese fleet crossed the Russian line, the classic T maneuver, and unleashed devastating broadsides. For 2 days, the sea became a furnace of fire and metal. By the time it ended, 21 Russian ships were sunk or captured. Only a few escaped to tell the tale. It was total annihilation, one of the greatest naval victories in history. The world had doubted Japan. Now it stood in awe. An Asian navy, trained, disciplined, and modern, had destroyed one of Europe's proudest fleets. With his army shattered and revolution brewing at home, Tsar Nicholas II had no choice but to seek peace. Negotiations took place in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, mediated by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. Japan's diplomats arrived not as supplicants, but as equals. They demanded recognition of their dominance in Korea and southern Manchuria, and the lease of Port Arthur. Russia refused to pay war indemnities, and though Japan was financially strained, it accepted the compromise. The Treaty of Portsmouth was signed in September 1905. Japan gained the respect it had long been denied, and emerged as the first Asian power of the modern age. Roosevelt would later receive the Nobel Peace Prize for his mediation. But in Japan, the true reward was moral, the proof that modernization, discipline, and unity could overcome centuries of Western domination. Yet victory came at a heavy cost. Nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers had died. The nation was burdened with debt. And when peace brought no great financial reward, riots broke out in Tokyo. Still, for the Meiji Emperor and his people, the war was a validation of an idea that through education, industry, and sacrifice, Japan could stand shoulder to shoulder with the West. The sons of samurai had become soldiers of industry. The spirit of Bushido had merged with the science of steel. Japan had stepped into the modern world and proved it could master its tools. The shockwaves of Japan's triumph reached far beyond the battlefield. In Russia, humiliation deepened the cracks of the empire. Strikes and protests swept through cities. By the end of 1905, revolution forced Nicholas II to promise a constitution and a Duma, the first parliament in Russian history. In Asia, Japan's victory lit a spark of hope. Nationalists in India, Vietnam, and China saw that an Asian nation could defy Europe and win. But in China itself, the war was a cruel reminder of weakness. The fighting had raged on Chinese soil, in Manchuria, the heartland of the Qing dynasty. Foreign troops had come and gone, while the imperial court in Beijing stood helpless. Among those who would later remember this humiliation was a young boy, Aisin Jioro Puyi, the last emperor of China. 3 decades later, the rising Japanese empire would return to Manchuria and make him its puppet. The seeds were sown here, in the ashes of 1905. In the end, the Russo-Japanese War was not merely a conflict over ports or railways. It was a test of ideas, of systems, of civilizations in transformation. Japan's victory was the victory of modernization itself, of schools that taught science alongside honor, of factories that forged ships beside shrines that prayed for courage, of a people willing to adapt without losing their soul. The Meiji Emperor, in his final years, would see his nation recognized as one of the great powers, but he knew that power carried responsibility to balance progress with wisdom, ambition with restraint. From the thunder of Port Arthur to the flames of Tsushima, Japan had proven its resolve. The world could no longer look down upon the East, and in the glow of that rising sun, a new age had begun, an age where modernization, once a lesson borrowed, became Japan's own reward. Thanks for watching. Subscribe now to uncover more hidden moments from the past.